So, according to Russell, we don't directly perceive the table. But what do we perceive if not ordinary objects? According to Russell, we directly perceive what he calls sense data. What are sense data? In the passage you read, Russell says the sense data you apprehend visually are colours. It's much simpler, though, to think of the sense data you see as patches of colour. And in fact, Russell shifts to this way of talking about sense data later in the Problems of Philosophy. So, when you take yourself to see the table, what you're directly perceiving is a whole bunch of sense data. A patch of dark brown here, a patch of lighter brown there, and so on and so on. Here's a highly accurate and technical diagram to help make this picture clearer. So, on the naive view, which we outlined in the first lecture, what you're directly perceiving is the ordinary object, the table. On the sense data view, what you're directly perceiving are sense data, so patches of colour. In the case of the table, presumably various patches of brown. You also directly perceive sense data with a particular shape. It's worth saying that while we have a visual example here where the sense data are patches of colour, of course, Russell wants to generalise his sense data view to things we can hear and things we can touch and smell as well. For example, on Russell's view, you never directly hear a bird. You just hear a sense datum that's high-pitched, melodic, shrill, and so on. And we haven't yet been told the exact relation between this collection of sense data and the ordinary objects. But for that question, see Wednesday's lecture. All we know so far about sense data is that we directly perceive them, and they're not identical to ordinary objects like the table. But can we say anything more than this? Well, in the extract we read, Russell doesn't go into much detail about the nature of sense data, but various theorists following him have. One thing sense data theorists tend to say is that sense data have the properties which they are perceived as having, which they appear to have. That is, if you have a perceptual experience of X, e.g. redness, squareness, roughness, shrillness, then there's a sense datum you're perceiving that really is X. There's a sense datum that is red, or square, or rough, or shrill. Take a look at our bauble again. On Russell's view, you're all currently seeing a sense datum which is red and a sense datum that's circular. You might have thought that the only circular and red thing around you right now is the bauble itself, or, in this case, the bauble on your screen. But not so on Russell's view. The bauble itself, or the bauble on your screen, isn't circular or red. Remember, ordinary objects are colourless and shapeless. While you are perceiving something that's circular and something that's red, these are just sense data and not ordinary objects. The third thing people tend to say about sense data is that they're mind-dependent. Mind dependence is a complicated and tricky piece of philosophical jargon, and we don't have time to go into it in much detail now, but the simplest version of this claim for our purposes is that necessarily a sense datum exists only if it's perceived. While Russell doesn't appear to explicitly commit himself to this thesis in the extract we read, it's important to bear the claim in mind as we move forward to Wednesday's lecture. To make the mind dependence thesis clear, think back to the afterimage of Taylor Swift you saw earlier on. On Russell's view, that afterimage is comprised of sense data. Now, how long did these sense data exist for? Well, you might think, for as long as you saw them, and no longer. Russell thinks this about everything you see. Sense data just aren't the kinds of things that can exist without being apprehended by someone. They're mind-dependent entities. So let's go back to this highly detailed scientific picture we began with. I think we have two questions to ask now. The first question is this: does sense data theory seem like a good model of what goes on when we have perceptual experiences? Is it a better model than the naive view? The second thing, what goes in for the question mark here? Is there something standing behind the sense data we perceive, the table itself? If so, what's the table like? How do we know the table exists? Wouldn't it be just simpler not to posit the table at all? These last few questions are going to be the topic of Wednesday's lecture.
Better than Dad's lectures. Don't forget the quiz, due on Friday. And read Vasubandhu for Wednesday.